I simply cannot find her.
Maria?
She's missing from the Abbey again.
Perhaps we should have put a cowbell around her neck.
I have looked everywhere, in all of the usual places.
Considering that it's Maria, I suggest you look in someplace unusual.
You know, 7 children and the Alps, supposedly. Beautiful music, gorgeous.
Picture this. You're watching one of the most beloved musicals of all time, singing along to Do-Re-Mi and feeling all warm and fuzzy inside. But what if I told you that behind those perfect Austrian mountains and those sweet family moments, there were scenes so controversial, so shocking, and so problematic that the studio made sure they would never see the light of day? What if the movie you thought you knew was hiding some of the darkest secrets in Hollywood history? Today, we're pulling back the curtain on The Sound of Music to reveal the forbidden scenes, the cut footage, and the behind-the-scenes drama that the producers desperately wanted to keep buried forever. Trust me, after you hear these stories, you'll never watch Maria twirl in that field the same way again. Let's start with something that will blow your mind. You know that iconic opening scene where Julie Andrews spins around on that beautiful mountain, arms outstretched, singing her heart out? Well, what you're seeing isn't exactly what happened. The truth is much more chaotic and borderline dangerous than anyone wanted you to know. The filmmakers strapped a cameraman to the side of a helicopter and flew it directly at Julie Andrews. Can you imagine that? A full-size helicopter with spinning blades racing toward one of Hollywood's biggest stars. But here's where it gets crazy. Every single time the helicopter finished its pass, the powerful downdraft from those jet engines would literally throw Julie Andrews to the ground like a rag doll. Picture this. Julie, trying to look graceful and magical, getting absolutely demolished by hurricane-force winds over and over again. She would hit the ground, spit out dirt and hay, struggle to her feet, and then have to do it all over again. This happened 6 or 7 times. Julie herself later said she kept begging them to fly in a wider circle, but they wanted that perfect shot so badly that they were willing to keep knocking her down. The choreographer had to hide in bushes with a megaphone because the helicopter was so loud that Julie couldn't hear when to start running and singing. Can you imagine being a world-famous actress, getting pounded by helicopter winds, while some guy yells at you from a bush? This wasn't the magical movie moment you thought it was. It was basically controlled chaos that could have seriously hurt someone. But that's just the beginning. Let's talk about the scene that almost never happened because of a threat that shook the entire production to its core. Christopher Plummer, the man who played Captain Von Trapp, almost walked off the set and destroyed the entire movie. Why? Because the studio wanted to do something that made his blood boil. The producers initially planned to have another singer's voice mixed with Christopher's voice for all his singing parts. They basically wanted to fake his entire musical performance. When Christopher found out about this plan, he was absolutely furious. He threatened to quit the movie entirely, which would have been a disaster since they'd already invested millions of dollars and months of work. This wasn't just about his ego. Christopher had taken singing lessons specifically for this role. He had worked his voice until it was raw, trying to get good enough to sing those songs. And then the studio basically told him, "Thanks, but we're going to have someone else do the real singing." The tension on set became so thick, you could cut it with a knife. The compromise they reached was still controversial. In the final movie, Captain Von Trapp's singing voice is actually a mixture of Christopher Plummer and a professional singer. So when you hear him sing Edelweiss, you're not really hearing Christopher at all. You're hearing a carefully crafted blend that the studio hoped no one would notice. This was considered so scandalous in Hollywood circles that it was kept secret for decades. Now, let's dive into something that will make you question everything you thought you knew about the Von Trapp children. The casting process of these kids was absolutely brutal, and some of the decisions made were shocking enough that the studio buried the detail for years. During filming, one of the child actors grew 6 inches in just 6 months. Nicholas Hammond, who played Friedrich, literally outgrew his character so drastically that they had to put other actors on boxes just to make the heights look normal. But here's what they didn't tell you. This massive growth spurt caused huge problems with continuity that they had to cover up in creative ways. Even more disturbing, Debbie Turner, who played Little Marta, lost her 2 front teeth during filming. Instead of working around this natural childhood event, the props department created fake teeth for her to wear. A little girl, probably already nervous about being in a major Hollywood movie, had to wear fake teeth for months just to maintain the movie's perfect image. But the real shock comes from what happened to Daniel Truitt, who played Rolf. For his role, they bleached and dyed his naturally dark hair blonde. The chemicals were so harsh that his hair was permanently damaged. Years later, he said his hair never grew back properly. He lost half of it, and what remained was thin and damaged for the rest of his life. The studio literally sacrificed an actor's appearance for a role, and then tried to keep quiet about the long-term damage they caused. Speaking of hair disasters, Julie Andrews faced her own nightmare. Her natural brown hair had to be dyed blonde for the role, but the first attempt went horribly wrong. Instead of the golden blonde they wanted, her hair turned orange. The entire production team was horrified. They had completely re-dye her hair, and then throughout the entire months-long filming process, they had to keep recoloring it over and over again to maintain the blonde look. The damage to Julie's hair was so severe that it became a constant source of stress on set. Every few weeks, they had to stop filming so she could spend hours getting her hair fixed, re-dyed, and styled. The chemicals were harsh. Her scalp was irritated, and she had to endure this torture repeatedly just to maintain the character's appearance. Now let's talk about the scenes that were so controversial. They were completely cut from the movie and buried in the studio vaults. There were 3 major scenes that never made it to theaters, and when you hear what they contained, you'll understand why. The first deleted scene involved Liesl spotting Rolf delivering telegrams and inviting him to meet Maria. This might sound innocent, but remember, Rolf eventually becomes a Nazi sympathizer who betrays a family. The original scene showed a much closer, more intimate relationship between Liesl and Rolf that made his later betrayal even more emotionally devastating. The studio decided this was too dark and complex for their family-friendly image. The second cut scene showed Captain Von Trapp walking alone in his garden at night, singing Edelweiss while thinking about Maria. But here's the controversial part. The scene then showed Maria in her bedroom window, looking down at him with obvious romantic longing. The implication was clear. There was mutual romantic attraction between them much earlier in the story than the final movie suggests. This created a huge problem because Maria was supposed to be the children's governess, in a position of trust and professional responsibility, showing that both she and the captain were harboring romantic feelings, while she was still officially just an employee crossed lines that made the studio executives very uncomfortable. The scene suggested an inappropriate workplace relationship that could have completely changed how audiences viewed the characters. The third deleted scene is perhaps the most telling of all. It involved a much longer conversation between Maria and the Mother Abbess that revealed more about Maria's past and her reasons for becoming a nun. This scene contained references to Maria's family background and personal struggles that painted a much darker, more complex picture of her character. The studio cut this because they wanted Maria to be a simple, pure, almost saint-like character. They didn't want audiences to know about her complicated past or the real reasons she sought refuge in the Abbey. They wanted her to be perfect and uncomplicated, not a real person with real problems and a real history. But the cover-ups didn't stop with deleted scenes. Let's talk about what happened during the filming of 16 Going on 17, an incident so serious that it could have ended someone's career and possibly their ability to ever dance again. Charmian Carr, who played Liesl, was performing the famous dance sequence in the gazebo when disaster struck. She was spinning and dancing with Daniel Truitt when she accidentally crashed right through one of the plate glass windows. The glass shattered around her, and she could have been seriously cut or even killed. But here's where the story gets really disturbing. Instead of stopping filming to properly treat her injuries and make sure she was okay, the production team made a decision that prioritized the movie over her well-being. They quickly bandaged up her ankle, covered the injury with makeup, and kept filming. During post-production, they worked overtime to edit out as much evidence of her injury as possible. They didn't want anyone to know that one of their stars had been hurt on set, because that might have led to questions about safety protocols and working conditions. Charmian had to continue dancing and performing on an injured ankle, smiling and acting like nothing had happened. This incident was kept quiet for decades because the studio was terrified of liability issues and negative publicity. They essentially forced an injured teenager to keep working, and then covered up the evidence of her injury. When you watch that scene now, you're seeing someone who was literally hurt and in pain, pretending everything was fine. The weather during filming created its own set of nightmarish conditions that the studio tried desperately to hide from the public. It rained almost constantly during the entire Austrian shoot. The cast and crew would spend hours huddled in tents and barns, waiting for breaks in the weather that sometimes never came. The conditions were so bad that when they needed to transport equipment and people up the mountain for the opening scene, the road had literally washed away. They had to use ox-drawn carts to get everyone and everything to the top of the mountain. Picture this: a major Hollywood production with A-list stars and millions of dollars of equipment being pulled up a mountain by oxen because the weather had made normal transportation impossible. Julie Andrews and the child actors would sit under tarps for hours, getting cold and wet, while the crew tried to figure out how to film in impossible conditions. The children were especially affected. They'd show up ready to work, only to spend the entire day sitting in the rain, waiting for weather that might never improve. The studio was so concerned about these conditions affecting the movie's image that they instructed everyone involved to never talk publicly about how miserable the filming actually was. They wanted the public to believe that making this musical was as magical and wonderful as the finished product appeared to be. Let's talk about one of the most shocking cover-ups of all. What really happened during the boat scene where Maria and the children fall into the water. In the final movie, it looks cute and funny, like a harmless accident that leads to some laughs. The reality was much more terrifying. Kim Carruth, who played little Gretel, couldn't swim. She was just a small child. And when they planned this scene, the safety protocols were nowhere near what they should have been. When the boat tipped over, Julie Andrews was supposed to fall forward and quickly grab Kim to keep her safe. But Julie fell backward instead. Suddenly, a non-swimming child was alone in the water, and panic erupted on the set. Crew members had to rush into water to rescue her before she could drown. For a few terrifying moments, everyone thought they were about to watch a child die during the filming of a family movie. They had to do this scene 4 times. For times, they put a child who couldn't swim in danger just to get the shot they wanted. Each time, the risk was real, and each time, they prioritized getting the perfect take over keeping everyone safe. The studio made sure this story never got out, because can you imagine the headlines? Child nearly drowns during Sound of Music filming. It would have been a public relations disaster, and probably would have led to investigations into their safety practices. Now let's dive into something that most people don't know about the puppet scene. You know that charming moment where Maria and the children perform The Lonely Goat Herd with puppets? What you're watching took 3 weeks of intensive rehearsal. But that's not the shocking part. The puppets were specially designed and choreographed, but the child actors struggled terribly with operating them. The puppets were heavy, the strings were complicated, and the children's hands would cramp up and bleed from holding control for hours during repeated takes. Julie Andrews herself later admitted that controlling those puppets was one of the most physically demanding parts of the entire movie. The puppeteers had to coach them for weeks, and even then, most of what you see in the final scene required special effects and editing tricks to make it look like the actors were actually controlling the puppets skillfully. The studio didn't want anyone to know how much help the actors needed with what should have been a simple, charming scene. They wanted audiences to believe that Julie Andrews and the children were naturally talented puppeteers, not struggling actors who needed weeks of training and lots of technical assistance to pull off a few minutes of screen time. But perhaps the most controversial aspect of the entire production was how the movie handled the Nazi occupation of Austria. The city of Salzburg initially refused to cooperate with scenes showing Nazi banners and swastikas being displayed on their buildings. They said the people of Salzburg were not Nazi sympathizers, and they wouldn't allow their city to be depicted that way, even in a movie. The filmmakers had to make a threat that shocked local officials. They said if Salzburg wouldn't cooperate, they would instead use real historical footage of Hitler marching into Austria with crowds of actual Nazi supporters cheering him on. This would have shown the world that there really were Austrian Nazi sympathizers, not the sanitized version the city preferred. Faced with this choice, Salzburg officials gave in, but they insisted that all Nazi banners and symbols be removed immediately after each scene was filmed. They also refused to allow any scenes showing crowds of people cheering for Nazis, even though historically, such crowds did exist. This compromise led to a version of history in the movie that was heavily sanitized and didn't accurately represent what really happened during the Nazi occupation. The studio was more interested in creating a feel-good family movie than in telling the true story of a family fleeing fascism. Here's something that will completely change how you watch the romantic scenes in the movie. When Julie Andrews and Christopher Plummer had to film their kiss scene, it took over 12 takes to get it right. But it wasn't because they were having trouble with the emotion or the timing. It was because they couldn't stop laughing. The massive arc lights being used to create the romantic moonlight effect made loud groaning and raspberry sounds when they were turned on. Every time the lights made these ridiculous noises, both actors would start giggling uncontrollably. The more they tried to be serious and romantic, the funnier the situation became to them. Director Robert Wise was so frustrated that he eventually gave up on proper lighting and filmed most of the scene in near darkness. When you watch that supposedly romantic, perfectly lit moonlit kiss, you're actually watching two actors who spent hours cracking up at fart noises made by movie lights. The studio was mortified that their big romantic scene was basically a comedy of errors. They made sure that no one involved would talk about the behind-the-scenes hilarity that made filming the scene almost impossible. They wanted audiences to believe in the perfect romance, not the reality of two professional actors who couldn't keep it together when faced with noisy equipment. Let's talk about what happened to Julie Andrews' voice, something that connects directly to this movie and changed her life forever. While filming The Sound of Music, Julie added an extra high note to the end of Do Re Mi that wasn't in the original Broadway version. She did it simply because she could reach that note, and it became one of the most iconic moments in the movie. But years later, that incredible voice that made this movie possible was permanently damaged. In 1997, Julie had throat surgery that was supposed to be routine, but something went terribly wrong. The surgery permanently destroyed her ability to sing the way she did in The Sound of Music. Julie sued the throat surgeon, and the case was settled in 2000 for an undisclosed amount. But because of the legal settlement, she's not allowed to talk about exactly what happened during that surgery. To this day, one of the most beloved voices in movie history has been silenced, and we may never know the full truth about how it happened. The connection to The Sound of Music makes this even more tragic. The voice that gave us Do Re Mi and My Favorite Thing, songs that have brought joy to millions of people for decades, was destroyed by medical negligence. It's like losing a national treasure, and the legal restrictions mean we can't even learn from what went wrong. Here's one final secret that the studio kept buried for years. The real Maria Von Trapp, the actual person the movie was based on, makes a cameo appearance in the film. You can spot her walking with her daughter and granddaughter when Julie Andrews as Maria leave the Abbey singing, I Have Confidence. But filming this cameo was a nightmare. The real Maria had never acted in a movie before and didn't understand that scenes had to be filmed multiple times from different angles. What should have been a simple walk-by shot took 3 hours to complete because Maria kept getting confused and frustrated by having to repeat the same action over and over again. The real Maria was reportedly not entirely happy with how she was portrayed in the movie. The film took significant liberties with her actual life story, romanticizing and sanitizing events that were much more complicated and difficult in reality. But the studio made sure her concerns never became public knowledge because they didn't want anything to damage the movie's reputation. When the real Maria and Julie Andrews appeared together on The Julie Andrews Hour in 1973, there was visible tension between them. They sang Edelweiss together, and Maria taught Julie how to properly yodel. But those who were there said you could feel the awkwardness between the real woman and the actress who had portrayed her. So there you have it. The forbidden scenes, the covered-up accidents, the damaged actors, and the sanitized history that went into making The Sound of Music. This wasn't the magical, effortless production that the studio wanted you to believe. It was a movie where actors were physically hurt, where safety was sacrificed for perfect shots, where historical truth was bent to create a more palatable story, and where the human cost of making movie magic was hidden from the public. The next time you watch Maria spinning in that field, remember that she was getting knocked down by helicopter winds over and over again. When you see the children singing happily, Remember that some of them were wearing fake teeth and had their hair permanently damaged by chemicals. When you watch The Romantic Kiss, remember that the actors were cracking up at noisy lights. And when you hear those beautiful songs, remember that the voice that made them famous was later destroyed in a medical tragedy that remains legally silenced. These forbidden scenes and hidden truths don't make The Sound of Music a bad movie. They make a very human movie, created by real people who struggled, got hurt, made mistakes, and kept working despite difficult conditions. The magic on screen came at real cost to real people, and maybe it's time we acknowledge that truth alongside the beauty of what they created. The Hills may be alive with the sound of music, but they're also alive with the sound of secrets, cover-ups, and the price of Hollywood perfection. Now, you know what no one was supposed to talk about. If this video opened your eyes to the hidden truth behind one of Hollywood's most beloved movies, make sure to hit that like button and share with your friends who think they know everything about the sound of music. Subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the secrets that Hollywood doesn't want you to know, and ring that notification bell so you never miss the truth behind your favorite films. Trust me, once you start learning what really went on behind the scenes of classic movies, you'll never watch them the same way again. Until next time, keep questioning what you see on screen, because the real story is often more fascinating than the fairy tale.